stand up here. Great, so I have a wonderful panel here today with a lot of diverse opinions about the rule that Kevin Culligan just walked us through. So I think we decided instead of having formal presentations, we would dispense with that and just have a conversation about what we heard and what we're thinking about the rule and what else is going on around the rule. Kevin talked about that this isn't just about one rule and its effect on the power sector, but sort of all the other market forces and state policies that are in play. And so we'll get at some of that today, and we will try to set aside then a good bit of time at the end for questions. So you have the bios in your program. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but we do have some wonderful people here. So from my immediate left on down, we have Commissioner Talina Mathews, who's a commissioner with the Kentucky Public Services Commission. We have Scott Weaver, who's the Director of Air Quality Services at AEP. And we have Megan Ceronsky, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Applied Environmental Law and Policy in Colorado, but many of us know her from her time in DC at the White House and EDF, so this is a nice homecoming, I think, for her. All right, so first, I guess I would just sort of kick it out to whoever wants to get this started. Do you have any sort of initial reactions to Kevin's presentation or to the Affordable Clean Energy Rule?
I guess I can start. You know, I think Kevin did a good job of summarizing kind of the content of the new rule. Obviously, it's a major departure from what we previously saw with the Clean Power Plan in terms of focusing on the actual heat rate improvements that can be achieved within the fence line. And I think, you know, as part of the rule, we've seen a lot more deference given to states and ultimately setting the standards for performance, which AEP is supportive of.
And from my perspective, at the commission, hasn't really gotten to us yet because no utility has brought any, you know, they have not had any conversations with us about what they would do differently as a result. Our Department for Environmental Protection and our Energy and Environment Cabinet filed comments that were largely in support of the changes, with particular being inside the fence line and affording states maximum flexibility.
Where to begin? Kevin said a lot of things that I completely agree with. You know, emissions are going down from the power sector, which is something I'm deeply grateful for given this moment in time. Coal-fired power plants are a huge part of what we need to be focusing on in terms of their contribution to emissions. I also completely agree with Kevin that everyone agrees that EPA's central job in the context of Section 111D is to identify what the best system of emission reduction is. I think perhaps where I disagree is I don't actually think EPA has done that here in this proposal. Instead, we have EPA sort of suggesting that its role in this proposal and going forward under Section 111D will be sort of more of an information kiosk sort of role, and that it's actually up to the states to figure out what is the best system of emission reduction and to apply it to their sources, which I think is a clear violation of what the statute directs and what Congress intended. But in that, it is certainly a major departure from where we were in the Clean Power Plan. But I think for me, some of the most significant parts of departure are, it's not just that we have a very different sort of framework when we're thinking about what is the best system of emission reduction for existing power plants and greenhouse gas emissions, although that it is a very significant departure in that context to shift from generation shifting to heat rate improvements. But for me, the most significant thing is you have the Environmental Protection Agency not actually focused on their mission, which is addressing climate change as this environmental problem and taking that very seriously. If you look at Section 111 and this proposal, the proposal doesn't really talk about climate change. It doesn't really talk about emissions impacts, and this is the mission of the Environmental Protection Agency. So in that context, this is a major departure, not just in sort of what we think is the best system of emission reduction, but from an EPA that is not actually doing its mission under the Clean Air Act. and in that context, also proposing these changes to the implementing regulations of Section 111D, where not just now, but in the future, EPA would continue to not actually play that role of figuring out what is the best system of emission reduction so that we can have consistency across a sector, so that you don't have the race to the bottom that the Clean Air Act was in part designed to prevent for states, because you don't want states to have to be in a position of effectively bargaining for industry by weakening their environmental protections. That doesn't help anybody, and this part of the Clean Air Act was intended to make sure that we do have a level playing field. These implementing regulations, which can be changed in the future, as can the Section 111D rule for greenhouse gas emissions in existing power plants, would take us very far away from the way that EPA has consistently implemented Section 111D since the very beginning of that framework. So I have more to say, but I will stop there for now.
All right, a lot to dig into here. Everyone touched on this theme of flexibility, which Kevin also talked about. And Megan, you just said that it's sort of in the name of flexibility, the EPA has become the information kiosk of potential best systems of emission reduction. So wanted to hear a little bit more about that, digging in a little bit more. Where do you see that the rule does afford flexibility, and where is it maybe not providing flexibility? So like how much authority, how much room to move do states really have in this rule? Commissioner.
And this is one that I flagged on my list of questions as I am not a Clean Air Act legal expert. And for that, I am grateful. One could argue that the Clean Power Plan was quite flexible. Some would argue that it was too flexible, remembering that there were 24 states that sued because it did extend so broadly. I think the opportunity, which could be seen as a criticism by some, of allowing useful life to be looked at and unit by unit analysis, does provide the regulators in the state some flexibility, and that's both the air regulators and the economic regulators.
Yeah, I think under this rule, a lot of the flexibility is kind of still to be determined, and getting back to some of Megan's points in terms of the change in interpretation, I think it's one that's going to play out largely in the courts in terms of what is that best system of emission reduction. I think this one is more focused on source-specific attributes, which doesn't create winners and losers. If you're the owner of a single coal plant, and that's your only mission, I don't know how you're going to expect someone else to build a new gas plant or a renewable plant for you to effectively have your compliance obligation met under, let's say, the Clean Power Plan, where this case, you can look at a source-specific basis and actually take into account what reductions might be made. I think within the flexibility, there's a lot that's going to be left up to regulatory interpretation outside of the legal system, but getting into what it constitutes an approvable state plan. There's not a lot of current substance within the ACE rule in terms of what EPA's criteria are for approving those. I know for some of our facilities, we'd like to see source-specific standards that take into account variability in operation, the availability of available heat rate improvements, as well as changes in the overall economics of operating the power grid, accommodating for less use of some of these units, as well as factors such as age. So I think states do need flexibility in that. I think other states who have market-based approaches in place, such as some of the RGGI states, might just like to rubber stamp them having RGGI as that standard for performance. So I think you're going to see a variety of different kind of approaches at the state level, which I think it's going to make it hard for a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of EPA ultimately signing off on some of these compliance plans.
Yeah, I completely agree with Scott. I mean, this has always been the question under the Clean Air Act, where you have a statute that was put in place with this broad language, and very clearly Congress was intentionally trying to give the agency some amount of ability to tailor the approach that they took to the nature of the pollutant and the nature of the sector. And the question has always been, how far does that, broad language and flexibility go? And when you get to a problem like climate change, greenhouse gases, and the power sector, where we've seen companies across the country make tremendous reductions in emissions, but doing it by shifting how much they're relying on different sources of power generation and shifting towards lower emitting sources of power generation. And then you have the Clean Air Act. And so how do you marry those two things? The Clean Power Plan was one attempt to do that. We never got an answer from the court because of many reasons. The Trump administration asked them not to provide an answer, and something happened behind closed doors with those judges, and they haven't yet provided an answer. And so I think there is a tension here where power companies and states across the country are showing us how you achieve cost-effective emission reductions, and the question is, how do we integrate the approaches that are actually happening on the ground with this statute that has been around for a while and has language that was written down, and we just figuring out how to optimize those two things is kind of the challenge before us. I don't think this particular proposal is actually trying to do that, right? This particular proposal is asking states and companies to do something that no state or company has ever done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from a power plant. No one is going around doing heat rate improvements to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because, by the way, you don't get many, if any, greenhouse gas emission reductions if you do heat rate improvements. So we have this very poor fit for the actual problem at hand in the proposal before us, but figuring out what we do going forward in terms of trying to accommodate what companies are actually doing, what states are actually doing in terms of their policies that they've put in place, and make this something where all of those forces can kind of work together in a harmonious fashion to achieve the environmental outcome is I think, the big challenge. This I see as a bit of a distraction from that question.
Yeah, I think part of it is the unique nature of the pollutant itself being so tied intrinsically to the fuel, the fossil fuel, and there isn't commercially available off-the-shelf technology like there is for SO2 and NOx to remove CO2. CCS isn't there yet. And as you indicated, there's been a number of other measures that have led to the decline in CO2 emissions we've seen in the power sector, but it hasn't been based on at the power plant technology, because there isn't one out there. So I think this is fundamentally different from other pollutants that EPA has dealt with over the years, and I think it gets to the fundamental question that's going to be raised again, both in the legal arena as well as the policy arena, is what was congressional intent in setting up the Clean Air Act, and is this something they envisioned? My company's long had the approach that addressing climate change will take a legislative solution because the Clean Air Act isn't well designed to regulate this pollutant. So I know EPA currently has authority to regulate under the Clean Air Act, but the existing tools we don't think fit the problem.
Picking up on two things that Scott just said, sort of, first, the fact that greenhouse gases are emitted from fossil fuels. So I'm going to throw two questions out here. From that, I'm sort of wondering reactions to why the rule only targets coal plants and not natural gas. And then the second, you've raised the point of CCS. And so we also have last week a new EPA proposal for 111B, as in boy, for the new power sector, new power plants that might come online. And EPA is sort of rolling back the Obama EPA era sort of standard that some amount of carbon capture would be required on new plants. And so wondering also about sort of as we go forward, what is the future of CCS, do you think, in the power sector? We've got a lot of federal tax credits and some DOE funding and demonstration projects, but sort of what's it going to take to have it taken up in a more widespread way in the power sector, or is that just not where you see the sector heading?
I will give my standard answer, and some of you will laugh. It all depends on the price of natural gas. And I think the leaving out the natural gas units from the rule was an effort to decrease the cost of the rule. I mean, you get half the reduction with a cheaper fuel. But it actually, from a regulatory perspective, that's a pretty good place to be. And I think CCS is going to depend on what is the alternative. Can you get 50% reduction by switching to natural gas? Or does the price of natural gas go up to the point where you would still want to use coal and put on carbon capture and storage, or utilization and storage?
Yeah, I think in terms of where CCS stands, we've been on the record saying that the technology isn't commercially available to be considered in a performance standard under 111B. I think this administration has recognized that the 111B standards are subject to updating, and taking an approach which looks at the existing technology that's out there, which is ultra supercritical coal boilers, I think is appropriate in terms of having that option for a new coal plant to be built. That being said, the current economics don't support that. In terms of how do we get to CCS, I think it's got to be a combination of economic conditions as well as technology development. The kind of interesting thing now is if you look at where natural gas prices are and projections of reserves, and most forecasts show relatively flat pricing or slow escalation in natural gas prices, which leads to the question, are you really going to put that CCS on a coal plant, or are you going to think about that on a new natural gas plant going forward? In either case, the technology needs to catch up, it needs to mature, it needs to come down in cost. I still think that if you look at kind of addressing climate change in an appreciable global fashion to reduce emissions at a global scale, if you look at some of the IPCC reports, what they're projecting or what they're suggesting is you need massive decarbonization. And to get there, you ultimately need, I think, some level of CCS in the equation to make the energy mix work. So I think there's a ways to go. We're talking, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, but I think CCS still needs to be a part of that equation.
And your company had a pilot project.
Correct.
Mountaineer.
Yeah. We were one of the early adopters, and a lot of lessons learned in terms of both regulatory issues in terms of who pays for technology that's not required yet by law, but also the technological challenges associated with carbon capture and storage. And we were one of the pioneers in the space. We had a project that lasted for a couple of years in West Virginia. We're actually capturing from a supercritical coal plant, injecting underground. It wasn't at the scale of the full plant. It was only a fraction of that capacity. But the technology is there. It's just not to the point where we need it, particularly if you look at massive decarbonization as a possibility on a global scale.
So I agree with everything that was said by both of my co-panelists, except for maybe the 20 to 40 years part, given that we don't have 20 to 40 years to address this problem. And I would actually argue that CCS technology, in part because it has been deployed, different pieces of it have been deployed in so many different industries in different ways. We haven't had it widespread at all in the power plant sector, and not at scale in the power sector in this country. But we've had pieces of that technology deployed in a lot of different industries for actually a very long time, such that we're much farther along with understanding CCS technology than we were with, say, scrubbers when those were first required for broad deployment under the Clean Air Act. You do have cost issues, and you do have questions about which of the existing power plants actually have the physical space to put CCS onto those plants. And so it is a question of which subcategory of plants could we deploy CCS on now, which ones would we need to do it later, when does it make sense actually in the context of natural gas, where you actually already have a gasified stream to begin with, rather than needing to go to gasification right away. But one of the aspects of the current proposal that I thought was particularly bizarre is that you have EPA taking this position that, well, we're going to do heat rate improvements, and we're not going to figure out what you can actually do with heat rate improvements because that's a plant-specific issue. But we're not going to have as a component of the best system of emission reduction co-firing with natural gas or carbon capture and sequestration because you can't do those at all of the plants, which is what they've already said about the heat rate improvements. And so if we're already in this world of doing a plant-by-plant look at what you can do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, you can do a plant-by-plant look at what you can do in terms of co-firing or CCS, which would be a far more legally resilient, I would argue, approach if you're staying within this sort of, we are just looking at these technologies that you can bolt onto a plant framework under the Clean Air Act, and I think that's a major weakness of the legal weakness of the proposal as it is. But just to underscore, I completely agree that we have to figure out this technology, maybe not in the United States, but certainly globally, if we are going to address the problem. And the mid-century strategy that came out at the very end of the prior administration was looking at carbon reducing CCS in the U.S. as sort of how we get to that very last part of decarbonization of the economy, where you've got biomass with CCS and are trying to create actually a bit of a sink there, which is like another step beyond the gas.
Can I ask a question? Sure. Would there be any? Sorry, we said conversation, so it goes both ways. Would there be any prohibition if an individual unit, if a state air agency wanted to look at an individual unit and look at, instead of heat rate improvements, could they propose that it be a carbon capture or a co-firing with natural gas? Is there a prohibition to that?
Under this proposal?
Yeah.
That's a great question. We should ask Kevin.
I would say not that I'm aware of, and I think that gets back to some of the flexibilities within the rule are subject to interpretation. I know within the proposal, EPA did indicate they're worried about kind of asymmetrical regulation, where you have effectively states taking counter positions on some of the issues in terms of their BSER that EPA has determined at the state level, and some of the conflicts that could create. But I don't think there's anything that automatically precludes states from looking at that. So if states want to go down that approach, I believe they can.
And there may be some that do, especially states that have an EOR opportunity.
Yeah, and obviously with the current tax credits out there, there is an economic incentive to look at CCS at this point. And hopefully some companies and entities might be able to take advantage of that and help move the technology along.
Sorry.
No, that's what we want to encourage that at this panel, so that's great. So many strands to pick up here. I guess what I was thinking about next, we've been talking a little bit about sort of, Scott, from a utility perspective, sort of thinking long-term, and if there are these reductions that need to be made, sort of the different ways you might make it. A lot of utilities and states were well underway sort of tackling emissions from the power sector under the architecture of the Clean Power Plan. Sort of got left up short there, but wondering sort of now, how do utilities react to this new rule, which is very different architecture? And this also gets a little bit into some of the different timelines we've already been hearing about, the sort of long-term planning horizon of utilities, the sort of, mid-century carbon reduction targets that are looming out there, the very near-term need to do something on mitigating greenhouse gases. We also have political cycles that are much shorter than those utility horizons. So just, I guess, question being, what do states and utilities do now? They were sort of on one particular track. That rule has been replaced by something very different. Do they sort of diligently start working on this? Do they try to shoehorn what they were already working on with the Clean Power Plan into this? Like, so how do you deal with this sort of whiplash of EPA rules?
I think the one thing that's become apparent is that our industry is in the midst of a massive transition, regulatory required or not. And My company's reduced emissions by 57% since the year 2000, greenhouse gas emissions, and conventional pollutants since 1990 by over 95%. And nothing with the change from the Clean Power Plan to the ACE rule is going to change that. If we look at our resource portfolio going forward, it's predominantly dominated by wind resources and solar resources. Our coal units are only getting older. That's the ones we haven't shut down. So I think we're in a kind of in a continuation pattern of the progress you've seen over the last 2 decades in terms of improving the environmental performance of the existing electric fleet. And I think the ACE rule allows states to look at existing generating units, figuring out what's cost effective going forward. But I don't think it gets in the point where it's influencing utility planning that would impede that progress, and it allows that kind of natural progression to occur. So while some might see the ACE rule as kind of backsliding versus the Clean Power Plan, we're effectively, as an electric sector, already to the Clean Power Plan targets. EPA's own analysis shows no difference in emissions between the two. So I think, there's we're going to continue in the near term the progress we're already making with additional unit retirements as an industry, additional development of renewable resources, and then I think the question remains, 10, 15 years down the line, is there an implementable, legislative solution that ultimately might provide some of the longer-term environmental certainty that many people are asking for? But I think our customers are already demanding a lot of this in terms of wanting a cleaner energy sector, and I think as an industry we're reacting to that, and that will continue to go.
Yeah, I think this is a remarkable moment in history when we have a transition from an administration. Well, I mean, this already happened. We had a transition from an administration that was extremely focused on addressing climate change to one that anything with the word climate has become a target, which is just, that is remarkable. But what is even more remarkable is that after that happened, you had major power company after major power company after major power company coming out with long-term decarbonization commitments, which to me is a signal that, one, all of the work and thinking and compliance planning that happened under the Clean Power Plan discussions really helped to educate all of us about how feasible the decarbonization pathways, at least in the near term, for folks could be, and how that could actually lead us to a place where we are saving customers money, we are providing affordable electricity, and we are making significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's incredible, but to have AEP achieving these tremendous emission reductions and committing to make further emission reductions, to have Southern Company out there with we're going to get somewhere around zero by 2050, to have DTE coming out with this major emission reduction commitment, Excel just a week or 2 ago saying we're going to get to zero by 2050, we're going to get to 80% by 2030. I mean, this is really quite amazing. A lot of it is, as Kevin pointed out, market forces that EPA has had nothing to do with. But I do think part of it is the process of states and companies and stakeholders coming together and figuring out, like, how if we're going, back in the world where we were going to do this, how are we going to do it, and what is the pathway to getting there, and having companies really taking a leadership role and realizing that they want to chart out this path for them. I mean, utilities, particularly in the regulated space, are kind of funny creatures. They're creatures of regulation. They're used to being told what to do and then doing it. Like that is, and they're very good at doing that. But there's an advantage to figuring out how you're going to do it so that you can then shape what people are telling you to do, and help to like influence the policy design. So for me, the fact that this rule has come out that has no ambition, no actual directives to states, and no timeline, and that it is not affecting the trajectory of the power sector is something that I am deeply reassured by and grateful for, and grateful for the leadership that we're seeing in the power sector these commitments to actually getting to these emission reduction targets, I think we're probably going to need some more policy assistance, policy drivers, regulatory certainty earlier than 15 years from now. And I'm hopeful that we can get there much sooner than that, both through under the Clean Air Act and maybe even under Congress. But the achievements have been truly remarkable and exciting.
Yeah, and my company's committed not only, I said 57% to date. Our goal is 80% by 2050. I think one of the things in terms of talking about compliance flexibility and ACE versus CPP, I think a lot of these reductions you've seen are, of course, due to market conditions, but also more, discussions with states and stakeholders and regulators. That under the CPP, while those discussions would have to occur as part of the process, it laid a pretty prescriptive pathway in terms of that pathway for emission reductions, but also the winners and losers in terms of how the reduction obligations were set forth. So I think the system we have is working. If you want more, I guess, defined progress, I think you're going to need another approach. If you want to go beyond the ACE rule, that takes into account those unique factors. But really, given the nature of our industry, I think the flexibility at the state level, particularly for regulated entities such as AEP, are important because ultimately the regulator needs to balance energy affordability, energy reliability, and environmental protection. And those discussions need to occur at the localized level.
I would argue that the economic regulator looks at the first two of those, and that it's another entity altogether that looks at the environmental protection.
Fair enough.
And by the way, you've made immense reductions in CO2 in the state of Kentucky, like almost 100%. You have one unit, one coal unit. You don't have any coal units in Kentucky anymore. You have a gas unit that's dispatched not so very often.
Yeah. Well, that brings up another consideration in terms of kind of localized impacts is as we, talk about our resource planning, a lot of this comes down to economic impacts. And as you indicated, we, shut down one coal unit, converted one to natural gas, but that was, while it was the least cost way to comply with various environmental regulations, it was at the cost of many jobs for Kentuckians. And
much angst.
And much angst. So I think that's where kind of localized flexibility in terms of emission pathways and trajectories and resource decisions is important as we address the issue going forward.
And it had nothing to do with carbon. It was a decision that was made in 05, 06, basically, to looking forward with an agreement with EPA on other more
it was a combination of criteria pollutants, but also the MATS rule going forward.
Yeah. And speaking of the MATS rule, I would argue that has had more to do with carbon. That the MATS rule coupled with market forces has, in Kentucky, for example, as of August of 2018, for the month, generation was less than 75% coal. That's not the numbers that I'm used to sitting in forums and reporting. I remember when we're nearly 97% coal-fired. So, and the entire state, I think 31% reduction from our 2005 levels, proposed and announced about another 8%, and that does not include the discussions going on at TVA right now about the Paradise units, which are huge, both in size and scope. So. And planning horizons for, especially in regulated states, your battleships, you're not canoes. You move very deliberately and slowly. A 4 to 6 year blip doesn't really, you're making 30, 40, 50-year decisions. And typically very conservatively making those decisions. And in the regulated states, you're going to get cost recovery for that decision, so you're somewhat insulated from a bad investment from the utility perspective. So I think that that makes you even more conservative in moving along. And there's not a clamor to build any generation right now. There's excess capacity almost everywhere.
So far we've been really focused on the climate components of the ACE rule, but of course, as Kevin noted, there's also a whole section of the proposal that relates to new source review reform. And so just sort of wondering from the panelists' point of view, which piece of this proposal has the potential to impact the power sector the most, to impact emissions the most? And then I'm also thinking back from this morning where Allison Silverstein mentioned that, should FERC get through this resilience docket and learn things and decide, yes, there's this real need to, subsidize coal plants that are otherwise falling out of the markets for not clearing, and then sort of her hypothesis was if they then went through another rulemaking, how many coal plants would be left there to benefit from that? And so I'm wondering the same thing here. There seems to be a shrinking universe of potential beneficiaries of a new source review reform, at least in the power sector. So just wondering your thoughts on that piece of this proposal and its sort of relative importance to the power sector and to air quality as compared to the climate piece.
I guess everybody's looking at me again.
Yeah, we need to switch spots.
So I mean, yeah. So I think the NSR provisions, largely speaking, we're supportive of the revisions they're proposing there. Having an hourly emissions test, we think, is a sensible interpretation. I'm not a lawyer. I haven't fought the battles over the years in terms of how NSR has been interpreted and enforced. But I think the hourly test goes a long way in ending some of that certainty. Additionally, we commented that for the proposed heat rate improvement measures that are listed, those should be automatically excluded from NSR as part of that, and that any measure that you're looking at in terms of implementing in that standard of performance, if there is a cost associated with NSR, that has to be considered in the cost of actually doing that project. So positive steps in terms of the industry, but as you've indicated, that universe of units that this could apply to going forward is getting smaller and smaller, and those units are getting older and older. So ultimately, the investment decisions to improve performance or replace components at those plants, it becomes harder and harder. I do think this rule has, or the proposed revisions have implications outside of our industry. I think I heard some comments from the administrator that they're not looking, or deputy administrator, they're not looking beyond the electric sector right now, but there are definitely some considerations for other industries going forward in terms of what EPA's laid out.
And Scott, I also think it's not entirely paranoia, but I think it's because you're in the middle that we all keep, anyone looking at you or beyond, at least
No.
it feels like it's on you and the other way around. So,
Commissioner, do you want me
to? Kentucky filed comments very supportive of the NSR changes. There's been a lot of discussion over the years. I remember many legislative panels on the limits that the NSR did on improving technology. That said, there's not a big clamor to do anything right now. I think the MATS closures kind of have filtered their way through. The smaller, older plants are, for the most part, gone. We've got a fleet that's still aging. We have some newer units. It may impact those newer units that are, not 50, 60, 70 years old. As I'm getting older, I tend to think a power plant's really old if it's older than me. And we'll not talk about how old that is. But I think it could have an impact on some of the newer, larger units that might have wanted to do something different. But again, it's unit by unit. Is there, we've had discussions of, some of our units have river on one side, railroad on the other, and they don't really have any room to add anything or do much of anything. So I've not seen or heard definitive answers from, no one out there in Kentucky has mentioned that they're going to be doing anything different. If the price of natural gas goes up, that might be a different decision. And it will be just I think it's a smaller universe of even just those that are left. I think there's a subset that will be affected, and everyone else will, their useful life will be ended.
Yeah, and I think if you look back at kind of, the impetus for NSR and, back in the 70s, it was, preventing a number of industries from just constantly replacing equipment at that site to circumvent, increased stringency on environmental regulations. And in terms of the scope of what we're looking at now in the coal universe, we're, as an industry, come to the realization that, these units are reaching the end of their useful lives here. And it's not every investment we put into those units is going to be closely scrutinized because of the economics of the industry, with natural gas as well as renewables being much more affordable these days. I think there's not the same willingness to invest in those coal units going forward.
Yeah, of course, part of the reason why we don't know what the impacts of the NSR reforms would be is because the proposal does not actually analyze what the impacts of the NSR reform would be. I can't even imagine the heartburn at OIRA when they received that in the email. And I think they're going to have to actually look at that in order to finalize the NSR reforms. We don't even know what the impacts are in terms of emissions, and the combination of heat rate improvement framework with NSR reform probably is actually greenhouse gas emissions increasing under most of the scenarios that I can envision. NSR reform has certainly been a conversation that has been around forever and ever and ever, and something that Bill Wareham, for example, I think keeps close to his heart, in part because it has been around forever and ever and ever, and it's been something that folks have wanted. I think this particular proposal, where you have a rule that is meant to identify those sources that are going to be relevant for areas that are trying to attain or maintain adherence with ambient air quality standards, the idea that you would then set a double trigger for who has to put on the best available pollution controls that is both an hourly rate of emissions increase and an annual emissions increase makes absolutely no sense if we're just doing a common sense review, because what matters obviously to the quality of your ambient air is what are the emissions that are actually coming out of that plant. And if you are increasing the emissions that are coming out of that plant on a yearly basis, but your hourly emissions rate has not gone up, that doesn't matter from the perspective of the actual impact on the ambient air, the health and the welfare of the people in that community. So I don't think there's any way to defend this under the statute, given what the whole point of this program is under the statute. So therefore, I don't actually think it's going to have much of an impact, because I don't think it's going to be around for very long. But I do think the agency also actually needs to do the modeling to see what impact does this have, and what impact does this have in combination with what they're proposing as the best system of emission reduction.
As the rule moves to be finalized, and Kevin said that the comments are being reviewed and some adjustments might be made, are there particular things you'll be looking for in the final rule, like questions that the proposal raised that you were hoping would get answered, or some thing that is in your comments that you wanted to, you're hoping that they consider?
A couple things on our end. One, some clarity that this rule only does apply to coal-based steam generators. There's some ambiguity on whether it's all fossil or all coal. Mm-hmm. Also, what is the applicability or the provability of state plans? Additional clarity around that, I think, is going to be very important. I think the third thing is any substantial deviations from the proposal in terms of the timelines or the measures considered in the BSER. So those are the key things we'll be looking for.
My list is Scott's list.
And I think our comments would indicate that we, a little more, as Scott said, a little more certainty around whether state plans will be approved, what those rules are, the knowledge that the first version of a rule can look very different from the next version of the rule. Clean power plant.
Oh dear.
Sorry, Kentucky had to, we had to do that one.
That was very well deserved.
There's a reason they put me up here. I am from a coal state with a huge industrial base that depends on that coal power, that both has a coal fleet and coal production. So I remember the day the final rule came out, and I remember the then Secretary of the Cabinet. I'm just glad he's still here, because I thought his head was going to blow off. And just regulatory. I think at the end of the day, regulatory certainty is, utilities can plan around it, commissions can look at it, but you have to know where you're going, and what the rules are to get there. So.
All right, we're going to do a quick lightning round and then get your questions ready, because we're about to the question and answer period. Do you think that the ACE rule will be finalized, upheld in the courts, and implemented?
Those are separate questions.
Yeah, those are, I was going to say.
Yeah, you could say yes, no, yes.
I think it'll be finalized.
Finalized, yes.
Okay, finalized, we have unanimous yes? Or Scott's even?
Finalized, yes.
Okay.
Finalized, yes.
Probably next few months, I'm guessing.
Okay. Upheld in court?
Back to that, I'm not a legal scholar, thank the Lord.
Yeah, I'll go with that as well.
I am a legal scholar. Not a scholar, really. At least I'm a lawyer. I don't think it will be upheld in court. Not most of it, at least.
And then implemented? Will we see this, or could political events intervene, or?
It'll be interesting to see. The Clean Power Plan, of course, was subject to stay. Whether this rule, a party can say there's immediate harm in implementation. I think there's probably some arguments out there whether that threshold is great enough, and this is me, I guess, wading into that legal space, sleeping at a Holiday Inn Express last night or something. But I think there's a little bit difference in this case in terms of you could actually see implementation go forward in some cases, particularly if states are early in getting their state plans submitted and approved, where you could see it implemented to some extent, I think. But I'd be interested to hear Megan's thoughts.
And there's no schedule. There's no schedule for compliance. And the schedule for state plans is so far out. I think the odds of this being implemented are so low, both because of political transitions and because of the litigation. So I mean, yes, the CPP, you don't have to stay this one. It's stayed already. Like, the design of the rule is a stay. There is no timing in it. So yeah, I'm highly dubious.
All right, with that, are there any questions from the audience?
Good job.
Stunned them into silence.
Stunned them into silence.
They're all asleep.
No, never. This is the most exciting stuff they've ever heard.
I can ask one.
Sure.
So, from a state perspective, from Commissioner Mathews, and put yourselves in a state perspective, any concerns about potential litigation of state plans if it were to be implemented, based on the fact that states are doing individual assessments of individual power plants? How is it different than litigation around a permit, getting down to that level of granularity? Is there a risk for states in that?
Yes. There are countless people lined up for the first state implementation plan to fight it. Yeah,
Yeah, I think one of the ironies of this rule versus the Clean Power Plan is by allowing that state flexibility, and I think there's going to be a lot more avenues for intervention in terms of what those compliance plans look like.
Right.
So, I mean, we're used to interveners in our rate cases around prudent investment in our fleet and operations, but here we're going to have interveners basically into the economics and decisions around running individual power plants, looking at technology, looking at forecasts, and it's literally could be at a plant-by-plant level. So you basically have
that now.
Yeah.
I mean, even in rate cases.
Even in rate cases.
Interveners wanting to weigh in on whether or not a power plant should exist any longer. I mean,
So,
in a
but I-
rate case,
yeah.
it's
So basically what this sets up is all of a sudden you have a rate case going for every plant within a state potentially, and it could get messy.
no. Well, for you, you don't have it.
Anything else?
Yeah, I think you're going to get pushback at the state implementation level, and then as each utility comes to its commission, if it has to, in a regulated state, asking for permission to do, environmental compliance planning, you're going to get another round, and then rate case, you're going to get another round. Lawyers should be very happy about this rule.
And
I think lawyers like ambiguity, right? In rulemaking, they can make money.
And from your commissioner role, you still have a role in terms of how AEP, the outcomes for AEP under this, because ultimately we have a power plant in West Virginia
Right.
that supplies our Kentucky
Right.
customers. So you're going to have stake in that game as well, even though we don't have a power plant sited in Kentucky.
And it will be, the Clean Power Plan, for example, was very difficult to think about that. Were the impacts on West Virginia or were the impacts on Kentucky? When you had, that was one of the things that we continually struggled with was, your load may not be in the same state as your generation for the large multi-state utilities anyway. So
All right.
then-
Let me see if there's any. Oh, yes, there is a question here.
Hey, Abby Smith with Bloomberg Environment. Scott and Talina, you both mentioned that you're looking for some more clarity from EPA on the approvability of state plans. And I know the proposal doesn't really go into, in the same way that the Clean Power Plan did, kind of this is what we're looking for. So what are you looking for? What sorts of specifications or approvability criteria are you looking for in the final rule?
I think there could be a couple different pieces. One, if states rely on those heat rate improvement measures, having a kind of simplified way to check off that those measures were explored enough to say whether or not they were applicable at an individual unit. Second, clarity in terms of how standards of performance could be used. Can you use different averaging periods? Does it have to be a historical basis or a forward-looking basis? And then I think we've also opened up the notion of there could be a mass-based option. EPA hasn't explicitly included or excluded that, but we'd like to see some clarity if that would be an approvable type option for states.
Wilson from DOE, the policy office. Megan, you mentioned that a lot of reductions are occurring without hardware. Could you, and behavioral changes, could you explain what some of those are and how they might fit into a rule like this?
I'm going to try, but I'm worried that I'm going to head not in the direction that you are actually asking about.
Okay, that's fine.
So you should stop me if I go off the rails. So we have a very interesting situation with greenhouse gases, and it's possible I never completed my thought, with greenhouse gas emissions in the power sector, where you get your emissions most cost effectively and flexibly by just using the generating sources that are lower emitting more and using the ones that are higher emitting less. You're just shifting who you're relying on because the grid is interconnected and because it's already managed to balance supply and demand on an instantaneous basis. That is the nature of the grid, and that is how we have most efficiently achieved greenhouse gas emissions. So although we do have these, you can actually use some wrenches and put a CCS unit on a plant or convert it to natural gas or co-fire with much more natural gas than you're using to prime the thing or whatever. All of those much more traditional sounding, we have our wrenches out, we have our toolkits out, we're adding things to the physical plant itself, are more expensive than the way that companies have been achieving emission reductions. And that's kind of a weird place to be in with a pollution problem, because we're used to the thing that we actually put, the physical thing that we add on to the plant that filters the pollutant somehow or prevents it from being created in the first place. And so, we could do a standard going, if we think forward to a time, would we have an administration that is interested in fulfilling its obligations under the Clean Air Act to identify the best system of emission reduction for greenhouse gas emissions in the power sector along the lines of the scale of the problem? You could do a standard that was based on CCS for those plants where CCS is physically possible and you've thought about your costs, and it would be based on co-firing for those plants that have access to gas, again considering cost and considering the physical constraints of the plant. That would be more expensive and less flexible than the way that power companies and states are achieving reductions right now, which is just to turn down the plants that are higher emitting more often and turn up the ones that are lower emitting more often. And it's just kind of the strangeness of greenhouse gas emissions and the power sector that these traditional technology intervention tools are more expensive and less flexible than our other option for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now tell me, did I in any way respond? Okay.
Yes, you did.
Good.
And I want to go to Scott, ask Scott, when AEP reduced its emissions, 57% or so, what were the mechanisms that it used to get where it is today?
Sure, it was a variety of things. One, we, starting in the early 2000s, started investing in the renewable space, first in Texas, and then with later in the decade with the PTC, looked at expanding our renewable portfolios, largely through purchase power agreements, which displaced our need for some of our fossil sources. We also really ramped up investment into natural gas combined cycle units in the middle of the decade, so that displaced some of the need for coal. I think the third thing that happened, and probably the most dramatic, was that natural gas prices came down dramatically, late 2000s. Largely spurred by the development of shale natural gas resources. And that switched the overall economics of the power grid. I think you saw load decline in some areas due to the loss of manufacturing, which obviously isn't a good thing. And then I think the final straw was the MATS rule in terms of requiring some of our units to invest in pollution controls that weren't cost effective. So we shut down a lot of coal-fired generation as a result of that rule. I think going forward, in terms of additional reductions to come, you're going to have the influence of natural gas prices, our just age of our coal fleet going forward, and the availability of renewable resources at historically low cost. I think they're all going to influence our further emission reduction strategy, and that's the kind of things we thought about in terms of laying out that 80% reduction goal by 2050.
So if the price of natural gas goes up, will your goal then change?
It might have to.
Might have to.
We've highlighted a number of factors that could influence that goal. Natural gas prices are one. The other we think about a lot is what happens to other sectors. Do we see a lot of electrification of the transport sector? And how does that influence our ultimate mass emissions? If we're relied upon for power, that's going to further stress our resources and lead to new resources, and that could also shift the mix of resources that are needed to supply that demand. So that's, there's some important considerations there.
Good. All right. Well, we're just about at the hour, and it is time for lunch, so we don't want to be standing between
No.
these lovely folks at lunch. But if you would join me, please, in a round of applause, thank this panelist for their